Hello, and welcome to the Oregon-California Trails Association podcast. If you're just tuning in, thank you so much for joining us. This podcast covers the stories of marginalized identities along the overland trails that are often undertold and underrepresented. Our goal is to bring these stories to light and show how diverse and multicultural American history has always been. When you grow up in Southern California, you learn about the gold rush. If you, like me, happened to live in a Southern California suburb called Temple City, you know that fourth grade in particular was the year that they taught you about the gold rush. Gold rush vocabulary quizzes, historical fiction novels set during the gold rush being read to us in class. My elementary school even set up an entire gold rush day where students got to play games and pan for gold pretending we were prospectors. This gold rush, or what I recognize now in hindsight was simply a California history unit, is what originally sparked my interest in Overland Trails history. It's all thanks to my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Sneed. Up until this point, history wasn't really my favorite subject, and American history was nice and all, but I never really found any connection in it that drew me in. That's all until I was in Mrs. Sneed's class. When she taught us about the gold rush and the building of the transcontinental railroads, she made sure we learned about the Chinese Americans who were an integral part of that history. As a Chinese American myself, this was the first time I was taught that people like me existed in American history that far back, and I was fascinated. When Mrs. Sneed assigned our class a creative writing project that required us to imagine what our lives would have been like on the Oregon Trail or during the gold rush, I remember being genuinely excited to work on it. It didn't feel entirely hypothetical to imagine that somebody like me could have existed back then. That first exposure to the more diverse stories of this time period stuck with me, and now with this podcast, I'm hoping to bring more stories like that to light. The history of the Overland Trails and the Gold Rush era, and basically what we know as America's Wild West, quote-unquote, is such a rich and diverse history, yet so much of it has yet to be explored in the mainstream. Today's podcast focuses on exactly what first caught my attention way back when in Mrs. Sneed's fourth grade class, Chinese American history. Our guest today is Dr. Sue Fawn Chung.
My name is Sue Fawn Chung, and I became very interested in Chinese American history when I was a senior, when I was a junior in college at UCLA. And I worked with Roger Daniels and started investigating Chinese American organizations. And I focused on the Chinese American Citizens Alliance and their fight for citizenship rights, rights of Americans, political action, political voting, and all of these concerns. Then I went to graduate school at Harvard University. So I wrote my senior honors thesis on the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. And then I went to Harvard graduate school majoring in East Asian studies and Asian Americans. And one of the things that I became interested in was the Chinese students from America who had gone to China to study and then returned, and some of the problems that they had in adjustment and acculturation and so forth. And then I went to Berkeley for my PhD, and I studied with Gunther Barth, as well as in Chinese history with Joseph Levinson and Frederick Wakeman. And my minor had always been art history. And so at Berkeley, I took lots of courses with James Cahill, one of the leading and most inspiring faculty members in the field of Chinese art history. So then I started teaching at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas for about 40 years and got deeply into Chinese American history. And that's where I am today, still interested in Chinese American history.
On the overland trails and in the early American West that have been kind of overlooked. So looking at stories of Asian American immigrants and African American immigrants and Native Americans, etc. And I'm really curious as to if there are any stories in particular that you've dealt with, that you've come across in your research that stood out to you.
Mm-hmm. There are so many sites that have been overlooked by tourists in general that the Chinese contributed to that make an interesting story. And one of them, of course, is, Americans always like to go to Yosemite National Park. Well, while you're in the park, there are a number of things to look at that the Chinese did that you may not have recognized. And one of them is they built the Washburn Road in the Mariposa Grove. So if you take the bus to see the Mariposa Grove, walk the mile or two of the Washburn Road, and you can see the kind of hard work the Chinese had to do to build that, as well as the road that exits from Tuolumne Meadows down to Lee Vining. I mean, that is a tremendous road. So you have this road construction that also can be seen when you go to Big Oak, which has, the museum will show you which roads the Chinese built, but you see these up and down and around the curves that the Chinese did way back in the 1860s and 70s, and you see them building these same kind of roads in railroad construction. And so while you're still at Yosemite, you take a ride on the Sugar Pine Railroad, which had half of its construction crew as Chinese and the other half as non-Chinese. So you ride this train, which is a shortened version of the longer logging train that existed way back then. And you see the curving and the up and down and the flumes that were built to send the logs down to the central part where the Sugar Pine Station is. And you realize that the Chinese had to work real hard to build a road like this. And usually many of the logging companies would not only hire the Chinese to build the train, which brought logs all over the West, but also to have them do the logging. And so in order not to cause trouble with the white loggers, they would put the Chinese at the furthest away from the station to do the logging. And the Chinese would log these logs knowing that some of these logs would go to China because China was rebuilding wooden buildings at this time and bought lots of wood or lumber from the United States, particularly from California. And these loggers probably had some experience because what was going on is when the British fought the Chinese over the issue of opium, that's called the Opium War, but the British call it the British-Chinese War, in the 1840s, they then decided that tea was the most important product that China could offer to the West. And so they cut down all the forests and planted tea plantations. And those who were loggers, especially in southeastern China, in the province of Guangdong, were out of a job. And so these out-of-job woodsmen came to the United States and found jobs in logging, which were in great demand. And one of the interesting sites that you can still see in Yosemite is just off of Bennetville. You do the mile or two hike up to Bennetville, which is very picturesque and very colorful, but it's uphill. And you see the cabin or boarding house where the Chinese miners and road builders lived. And then if you go a little further to something called Corewood Ridge, you see all of these corewood logs. Corewood logs are about 4 feet in length that the Chinese had cut in 1880. And looking around the area of the cut logs, you will see broken pieces of Chinese pottery, because that's where the Chinese lived or ate while they were cutting wood. So, a preserved spot, and you're an amateur archaeologist at that point. Then going to a more agricultural area, you could go to Central California, to the area of Walnut Grove and Locke. And here you find a most unusual site, for the Chinese had begun to occupy Walnut Grove and what they called Lockport in the early, I would say 1900s. And then Walnut Grove burned down, and so the Chinese moved to Lockport, which they then renamed Locke around 1914, 1915. And that's where my uncle was born. So I know it was at least in 1915 that it existed, although his birth certificate says Lockport, not Locke, but it was the same place. And what you see there are an old Chinese community. And Locke was fascinating because from 1915 to about 1920, it was almost 100% Chinese from Zhongshan County in Guangdong province. And these people knew each other, were familiar with each other. They had a school for the children. They had a gambling hall. They even had a beautiful theater, which later became a house of prostitution, unfortunately. But they had an almost all Chinese environment. And they had at least 2 hotels and restaurants, and the Chinese agricultural workers in the Delta would come to Locke for recreation and so forth, especially during the weekends and holidays. And so it was a busy place, sometimes during the week and sometimes sort of relatively quiet. But you can still see a lot of the remnants of the Chinese experience there. Another interesting place that I recommend your constituents go to is Angel Island. And Angel Island opened in 1910 and closed around 1940, but it was during that period that it became the Ellis Island of the West. And so you have this multitude of immigrants coming in, primarily Chinese, but also Japanese, Mexicans, Russians, I said the wrong word, well, any other immigrants from that area. So it was a mixed bag, but they often would hold the Chinese, you might say, in confinement for anywhere from up to 3 months until their paperwork was straightened out, or until they could decide, the immigration officials could decide that they could enter into the United States. And that was really problematic because there was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited Chinese laborers from coming in. And in 1892, they redefined what a laborer was to include wives of laborers, ministers. So if you were a Christian minister in China and you wanted to come in, you couldn't. They included doctors, all kinds of professions that we today would not think of as being laborers were prohibited from entering after 1892. And then in 1904, that was extended. And then in 1924, they established a quota system, which varied in number, but eventually was something like 105 Chinese from anywhere in the world. And that's all that could enter in that one time period, with the exception of merchants, diplomats, teachers, and students. So if you wanted to come to the United States, that was the way to get in. So it was very difficult. And you could see the kitchen where they all ate as well. And they had established a really wonderful museum showing the activities and lifestyle of those on Angel Island. And the photographer was a Chinese American man named Robert Lim. And he was the son of a railroad worker, a railroad labor contractor. So you have a Chinese perspective to some of the photographs that he took of the people in Angel Island. And then if you're interested in cemeteries, you can see a variety of cemeteries. If you go right now, it's the Spring Festival, the Qingming festival, and you're supposed to sweep the tombs and the cemeteries and keep them clean and offer grave offerings of food to your ancestors. And so we see this going on until April 22nd of this year, but it happens every year. And this was one of the ways the Chinese clean their tombs. So if you go to Colma, just south of San Francisco, you will see lots of graves, lots of dead people. And the Chinese at this time will be making offerings to their ancestors or to their relatives who recently passed away. But the markers on these Chinese cemeteries are also fascinating. Some of them are very plain, but others have pictures of the people who are buried underneath. And sometimes you will see a husband and wife and child, or you'll see a husband and his first and second wife or concubine, as you may have it, and you see the dates at where they came from and so forth. Now, some people are buried, but the Chinese also believe in being buried in their home villages. And so many of the bodies were exhumed and sent back to Guangdong, for example, and are buried there. But with the problem of overcrowded cemeteries in China, some Americans have gone to Guangdong, had their ancestor exhumed and brought back and reburied in the United States. And so the tomb cleaning, tomb sweeping ceremony can occur conveniently in the United States. So just those are just a few of the things you could do.
I'm from California myself. I'd been to Yosemite on several school trips in those exact areas. Like, I know exactly what you're talking about. And they never mentioned on the tour that we took that the Chinese helped construct those roads.
Build the roads, yeah.
Yeah, build the roads.
Well, not only that, but they also clean the linens and so forth for some of the hotels, including the Wawona Hotel. So the Wawona Hotel has preserved its Chinese laundry, and it's just opening to the public this year. And so if you go to Yosemite this year, do stop in. It's right near the hotel. They can direct you to where it is, and you'll see a Chinese laundry and what it looked like and what they were doing and how long they lived there, as long as the Washburn family was running the hotel. And once they stopped, the next owners didn't want Chinese laundrymen, so that was the end of the Chinese laundry.
Something that's really stood out to me as I've tried to do research myself on Chinese Americans in those time periods is community, like how they found community, because I feel like, especially with the Exclusion Act, you'd think it would be difficult to have that sense of community because, women and children weren't allowed in. And, maybe there were barriers from certain cultural practices. And did you encounter any stories about Chinese communities or any histories of communities coming together in certain ways for holidays or anything else like that?
Oh, well, it's just starting off with the Chinese railroad workers. When they started going, they decided it was Chinese New Year's time and they wanted to celebrate Chinese New Year's. And so they asked their supervisor, James Harvey Strobridge, if they could have 2 or 3 days off for Chinese New Year's. And he begrudgingly said yes. And so from 1864 until they finished building the railroad in 1869, the Chinese railroad workers, which numbered from anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000, depending on who you count and who you don't count, had Chinese New Year's off for those years. And the tradition of celebrating Chinese New Year's spread throughout Chinese communities to always include the non-Chinese community. So they were brought into the celebration. And that probably is one of the reasons why we have these big Chinese New Year celebrations at Marysville, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and even during the Irish celebration of St. Patrick's Day, there was a Chinese representative there because they wanted to acknowledge the whole idea of multi-ethnic celebrations of these kinds of festivals. The binding element in the Chinese Americans were the Chinese organizations that were started in the United States. Now, some of them have antecedents in China, but the antecedent isn't always as strong as most American writers would like to express them to be. So you have what we call the Chinese Six Companies, which were really made up of the regional associations, the Huiguan. And these associations were the binding thing for most of the Chinese because they all came from the same area, county that is, and they have the same language. The Guangdong area has 7 subdialects of Cantonese, and some of them are mutually unintelligible, and I can swear to that. Believe me, I can only understand 1 or 2 dialects, and then the rest, forget it. And they also had different customs and festivals and cuisine. So they weren't all alike. They weren't the same, but they were very different. And so your main association was with your regional organization or with your clan organization. Now, clans are made up of people from their last name or family name, and you could come from anywhere, but if your last name was the same character, then you belonged to a family association. And these 2 associations probably gave you the tie and the comfort of home because you no longer had mom and dad and grandpa and grandma and all your relatives supporting you at home. Here you only had these people who may or may not have been directly related to you, and they provided your recreation, your banquets, your food, because it would be the same, and the customs that you would share for different festivals and which festivals you felt were important and how do you celebrate that festival. Do you have a mooncake in October, or what do you do? These kinds of things.
I feel like growing up in California, we learn about the gold rush, we learn about the Chinese in America, but most of what I was taught, at least as a child, when it comes to the Chinese in America is usually not very positive. Like, it's usually we're taught that they were horribly mistreated and, you know, attacked, and there was all this prejudice, which it definitely existed. That was definitely there. But I'm wondering if you, in your research, ever discovered stories of like friendships between the Chinese and other Americans, whether they're, you know, European Americans or other immigrants, or, you know, mixed race families and mixed race marriages and things like that. I know because of miscegenation laws, the mixed race marriages probably wouldn't have been legal, but if there was any recording of those kinds of bonds and communities being like intra-ethnic communities being formed.
Well, it's very interesting because of the overwhelming power of the labor unions and the politicians who were part of the anti-Chinese movement, and the newspapers, especially the newspapers who spread anti-Chinese misinformation, you might say. You don't hear the stories of the Chinese and non-Chinese good relations. When I first started out and went to Nevada, you know, I assumed that all white miners hated the Chinese, only to find out in Nevada that they worked together and mined together, especially in Tuscarora and far out mining communities that said, well, we let anybody mine. And so if they want to mine together, that's fine. And so we see an iconic picture of Chinese, white, and Mexican miners working together in Tuscarora. And this occurred in many other places. And then there were the Chinese servants. They were always, many of them were loved by their employer. And so there was this one case in the 1870s of a young boy who came to the United States with no relatives. He was 9 years old. And the missionary named Ira Condit said, I have a place where you can stay and work as a servant. So he became the servant of the Curtis family, who was a lawyer for the Central Pacific Railroad. And the Curtises didn't have any children, so they looked upon this little boy as their own son. And for 9 years, he worked for them, and then he passed away. And so they decided to bury him in Sacramento's old cemetery, which is where they are also buried. And the father spent $1,200 on a monument to this little boy as his cemetery marker. And it's one of the impressive markers that you will see when you go to the old Sacramento Cemetery for Mr. Ye, as he was called at that time. And then there are those Americans who hid the Chinese during anti-Chinese movements. And they were all over, and they did all kinds of things to help their Chinese friends when there was an anti-Chinese movement, such as, kicking all the Chinese out of Chinatown or burning Chinatown or something like that. There was one man named Tubbs in San Francisco who owned the largest cordage company in all of the Western United States. Cordage is that rope that you use for shipping. And he not only hired Chinese in his factory, but he also found a young boy named Lim Lip Hong, whom he favored very much, hired him to work as a cabin boy where he learned English on one of his 17 ships, and then sponsored the family to live in South San Francisco near the Tubb Cordage factory, and then helped the boys when they grew up. And when the 1906 earthquake and fire occurred, he had housed about 300 displaced Chinese on his ranch, then housed 300 others on Lim Lip Hong's ranch next to his. So he was giving shelter to those Chinese who had no place to go because of the fire and the earthquake in 1906. And the family continued doing this kind of thing throughout most of their lives.
I wish that stories like these were more,
Yes.
commonly known or taught or talked about, because they're all so
Right.
wonderful, especially, right now where there's the anti-Asian hate movement and all of that.
Correct.
Because I think when it comes to the Chinese in America, a lot of people forget that Chinese Americans were some of the earliest American immigrants.
Well, two of the most famous anti-Chinese movements were the lynching in 1871 in Los Angeles of Chinese in Chinatown, and then the Rock Springs Massacre, which occurred in 1885 and gave birth to a lot of anti-Chinese violence in that period. But new research has come to show that more Chinese were injured in that riot and more Chinese were killed than has been publicly known. And it's one of the few Chinese massacres that the government paid what we call retribution to. So, there's all this new information coming about that we're learning more about what happened to the Chinese Americans and how they were oppressed and how violence occurred to them, but also how they developed and how they made contributions to the development of the United States. Mm-hmm. For without the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and all of the attendant lines, both within the state and between the states, you have a great growth of population due to the trains and a growth of industry, because now you could transport your goods throughout the United States, and just a greater prosperity really based on the hard work of the Chinese laborers.
And I think it's interesting how their contributions are so visual. There are so many physical remnants and physical, there's so much physical evidence of what they did and where they lived, if you know where to look for it. And some of it, like you were saying about the locations in Yosemite, if you don't know about it, they could be easy to miss. But, Chinatown, I feel like the concept of a Chinatown is, I feel, very iconic in American culture and pop culture in general. And, when people go to travel to California, to San Francisco, it's a big tourist attraction. The roofs are so iconic. They're such an iconic image. And I think food also, I feel, is a pretty significant contribution, because there are so many cuisines, like so many foods and dishes that are specifically Chinese American,
Right.
that are literally, they only exist because the Chinese came to America.
Well, you probably don't realize this, but by 1970, there were more Chinese restaurants or cafes of all sizes than there were McDonald's in the United States. So, and
I
in Las
didn't know
Vegas,
that. That's
yeah,
so
and in Las Vegas
interesting.
alone, they outnumbered any other ethnic group in numbers of restaurants or cafes. Counting any kind of place that is serving Chinese food because of the popularity of Chinese cuisine.
I was trying to do some research last summer, like I said, and I was going through archives, and I feel like the most common item that I would find in the digital archives would be a menu. And it is interesting to see how the names of the dishes have really not changed that much. Like some of the menus look like menus that could be for places around where I live back in Arcadia.
Right, right. And, just looking at chop suey, for example, I
Right.
know someone said to me, well, how do you learn how to cook chop suey if it was invented in New York for a visiting Chinese dignitary who surprised the restaurant owner that he was coming and that he wanted some Chinese food and they didn't have anything really in hand to make for him. So they threw a bunch of stuff together and said, here's chop suey. So what we see happening is that restaurants wanted to learn how to make chop suey. And so they started publishing by 1900, 1924, cookbooks on how to make chop suey and Chinese dishes. At the same time, Chinese cooks were learning how to make American dishes. And so there were cookbooks in Chinese, how to percolate coffee, how to make tea for the Western audience, how to fry a steak, so that many of the restaurants that I had assumed along the train tracks, for example, that were owned by Chinese and with Chinese cooks, were cooking Chinese food for the train passengers and the crew member, only to find out that they were making American food for the train passengers and the train crewmen. And this was rather standard that you would go to a Chinese restaurant to have American food.
That's hilarious. I didn't know that. Again, just the kind of amalgamation of all the different cultures coming together in, early American Western history is always very fascinating to me. And I'm wondering if you have any recommendations of places people can look if they're interested in learning more of this kind of history that hasn't really been widely taught.
Well, I highly recommend all of the Chinese American museums that have popped up, especially the one in New York, the one in Los Angeles, the ones in San Francisco. I mean, these museums are trying to teach the general public something about Chinese American history and often have a section of, you might call, the unknown facts or unknown figures of Chinese Americans who made contributions to the American society.
Are there any stories people can look back on right now during this movement of, anti-Asian hate and trying to promote solidarity between Chinese and non-Chinese Americans? Are there any examples from history that people can look to, or stories that they can look to?
Well, of course, the recognition of the Chinese railroad workers by Congress and by the Secretary of Labor at the time, the whole idea that the Chinese are now participating in the Golden Spike ceremony every May 10th in Salt Lake City, Utah. And, just the whole idea of the Asian American month of April being established so that you recognize and can learn about Chinese Americans that you may have not heard about or learned about otherwise. And I think these are real positive steps because, as many people have said, if you meet a stranger and you know nothing about him, your immediate reaction is fear. And so what you really need to do to overcome this fear or suspicion is to learn about him, his culture, his lifestyle, so that it can be appreciated or at least known about, so that you can understand why he is doing something that he's doing or why he has a certain attitude. For knowledge is really important. And as Confucius said way back in the 4th century, education is the equalizer of mankind.
The Oregon-California Trails Association is the nation's largest and most influential organization dedicated to the preservation and protection of overland immigrant trails and the immigrant experience. Our mission at OCTA is to protect the historic immigrant trails legacy by promoting research, education, preservation activities, and public awareness of the trails, and to work with others to promote these causes. Thank you so much for tuning into our podcast. If you're interested in volunteering, becoming a member, or just learning more about the Oregon-California Trails Association, please visit our website at www.octa-trails.org. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube at Oregon-California Trails Association and on Twitter and Instagram at OCTA_1836.